Okay, I think that we are recording, so let me make this full screen for us. Okay, so we are looking at chapter 9 in my book. We're going to talk a little bit about cellular respiration and fermentation. So there's 3 sections. In the first section, we're going to look a little bit at where organisms get the energy that they need for life, and we're going to look at cellular respiration. In the second section, we're going to go a little bit more in depth to glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. And then finally, in the third section, we're going to talk a bit about how organisms get energy if there's no oxygen available. So, if you have ever wondered why you need oxygen to breathe, it's because you need that oxygen for your body to use the food that you eat. The food that you eat cannot be directly used by your cells. So this cellular respiration involves a series of controlled reactions that release energy that are found in the carbohydrates that you've eaten, and they transfer it to ATP, which is the energy that your cell actually uses. So cellular means that it happens in the cell, and respiration means breathing. So it's literally your cells are breathing. You inhale oxygen and you exhale carbon dioxide. This happens in the mitochondria. The mitochondria has a smooth outer surface. It has folded inner membranes called cristae, and then inside of that cristae is the matrix. It's like the space inside of that inner membrane. In this picture, energy is being released in the form of light and heat from the marshmallow. So we've talked before about how the different ways energy is released. Next is the equation for respiration. This is the overall chemical summary. So oxygen and glucose are going to yield carbon dioxide, water, and energy. So these are your reactants, your oxygen and glucose, and the products are carbon dioxide, water, and energy. The reaction shown here is kind of a simplification of many sub-reactions, but this is the equation. There are 3 stages of respiration. First, glucose is the molecule that undergoes glycolysis. That's this step right up here behind me. Oxygen is involved in electron transport. So you'll see here we have some carbon dioxide that's being released during the Krebs cycle. We have water being released. Oxygen is being used. Energy is released at every stage. So 3 basic stages. We have glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. Stage 1 is glycolysis. It's the first part of respiration. During glycolysis, the glucose is broken down into 2 smaller molecules called pyruvate. Since glucose has 6 carbons, each of those 2 pyruvates have 3 carbons. They're split equally. And at the end of glycolysis, about 90% of the chemical energy that was available from the glucose is still unused. It's locked in the chemical bonds of that pyruvate or pyruvic acid. This process of glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm, and it is anaerobic, which means it does not require any oxygen. If I move me out of the way, over here you see these 6 round shapes. It's 6 carbons for glucose. Some energy in the form of ATP is necessary to get the glycolysis process started. So it takes 2 ATP to get started. The molecules of ATP are invested, meaning that the energy stored in the ATP is released to help start this process of glycolysis. The products of glycolysis are going to be 2 NADH molecules, 4 ATP molecules, and then 2 pyruvic acid. 4 high energy electrons are passed to the carrier NAD+ to produce NADH. 4 ATP are produced, but there's only a net gain of 2 because it took 2 to get started. So even though you produce 2, you use 2 kind of as like a payment, and so you are only yielding 2. And then the 2-pyruvic acid are a product of glycolysis. It was just the 6 carbon sugar split now into 2 to 3 carbon sugars. The NADH is going to go on to the electron transport chain. The pyruvic acid goes to the Krebs cycle, and ATP gets used up by the cells. Here we go. The Krebs cycle is the second part of cellular respiration. It can also be called the citric acid cycle. This happens in the matrix of the mitochondria, and this process is anaerobic, which means this process is aerobic, which means it requires oxygen. A little bit more energy is converted during this stage. It is a series of chemical reactions that involve carbon compounds. So carbon has this remarkable ability to easily combine with itself and with other atoms, and the result is a tremendous number of carbon compounds in living things. So following the changing carbon compounds is key to understanding the Krebs cycle. So the pyruvic acid from the glycolysis stage, let's move me out of the way again. Okay, back over here. The pyruvic acid from glycolysis is now going to be broken down in the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle into carbon dioxide. And you can see it exiting right here. So because glycolysis produces 2 molecules of pyruvic acid for each glucose, the Krebs cycle turns twice for each glucose molecule that entered glycolysis. Pyruvic acid from glycolysis passes through the 2 membranes of the mitochondria down into this matrix. So here we have pyruvic acid entering into the matrix. And we have a little close-up picture over here. 1 carbon atom from pyruvic acid is going to become part of the molecule of carbon dioxide when it's given off here. And it's eventually released into the air. The other 2... trying to get my mouse back. There we go. The other 2 rearrange and form this acetic acid, which becomes acetyl-CoA when it binds with the coenzyme A. So we have these two becoming acetyl-CoA. During this process, 2 high-energy electrons are passed to NAD+, and they are producing NADH. Acetyl-CoA here is going to combine with a 4 carbon compound in the Krebs cycle and produce citric acid. We're going to follow the 6 carbon atoms through the cycle. So the first one we've already looked at a little bit. 1 carbon is removed and then another, and they are released as carbon dioxide, and so you end up with, down here, this is released as carbon dioxide, down here you end up with a 4 carbon molecule. This whole thing is referred to as a cycle because that 4 carbon molecule produced in this step is the same that's going to accept the acetyl-CoA in the first step, and the molecule needed to start the reaction is made with every turn. So glycolysis produces 2 molecules of pyruvic acid for each glucose. So for 1 glucose, you get 2 pyruvic acid. 2 turns of the Krebs cycle happens from 1 glucose, and for every 2 turns from that 1 glucose, you get 2 ATP molecules being made. So each starting molecule of glucose results in 2 complete turns of the Krebs cycle, 2 ATP molecules. Now, if you look at the electron carriers, NAD+, NAD, FAD, energy released by the breaking and rearranging of the carbon bonds is captured in those forms of energy. Okay, we talked about energy extraction. The last stage is, the last stage is this electron transport cycle, or electron transport chain. Sorry guys, I'm having some technical difficulties. Okay, stage 3, electron transport chain. The NADH and FADH2 were byproducts from glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, and these high energy electrons are now coming into the electron transport chain from glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. Highlighted here, or circled, are electron carriers. The high energy electrons from the NADH and the FADH2 are going to be passed from carrier to carrier. Get my hand out of the way. From carrier to carrier. In this image, you see the process of the hydrogen atoms, the oxygen, and the electrons combining to produce 2 molecules of water. So water is formed when oxygen accepts the electrons in combination with the hydrogen. The electron carriers use the energy to transport the hydrogen ions across that inner membrane into the inner membrane space. So in prokaryotes, the electron transport chain is actually going to be happening in the cell membrane. Here we go. The inner mitochondrial membrane contains enzymes known as ATP synthase, and that's what you're seeing here. The concentration gradient of the hydrogen ions across that inner mitochondrial membrane causes them to have to go through this ATP synthase because they can't pass across the membrane. As the hydrogen ions rush through that ATP synthase, the base of the synthase rotates and it's going to generate ATP. For each rotation, the enzyme grabs an ADP molecule, attaches a phosphate, makes ATP. So on average, each pair of high energy electrons that move down the full length of the electron transport chain are going to provide enough energy to produce the molecules of ATP, to produce 3 molecules of ATP. So a little overview of how much ATP is actually made from each reaction. Glycolysis produces energy in the form of 2 ATP. Krebs cycle produces carbon dioxide and 2 ATP. The electron transport chain produces water and 32 ATP. So the total ATP is about 36, but this can vary. So these numbers add up to 36, but the actual number varies and can fall between a range of 30 to 42. 36 here is reasonable because it assumes that for 2 ATPs for each FADH2, 3 ATPs per NADH would approximately be 36. So this is all the energy that can be generated in aerobic conditions, so conditions that have oxygen available. Now, photosynthesis and respiration are balanced. This is why Earth doesn't run out of oxygen and why there's not too much carbon dioxide. So photosynthesis removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It also releases oxygen into the atmosphere, which is then taken up in respiration to release energy from food. Carbon dioxide is produced. Photosynthesis takes it up. It's a big cycle. Now, if you're making your body work harder than usual, then your body's going to require more ATP, which is going to require more oxygen. So depending on what type of shape you're in, this oxygen might not be available. During fermentation, cells convert NADH to NAD plus by passing high energy electrons back to the pyruvic acid. This converts NADH back into the electron carrier NAD plus, which allows glycolysis a steady supply of ATP. Fermentation is anaerobic because it does not require oxygen, and it happens in the cytoplasm of cells. Sometimes glycolysis and fermentation are together referred to as anaerobic respiration because neither of them require oxygen. So you'll notice that in this figure you don't see any oxygen. Oxygen means anaerobic. No oxygen means anaerobic. So while this figure shows both alcoholic and lactic acid fermentation, they don't normally occur at the same time. Most organisms are either going to carry out one process or the other. And this figure also shows the initial stage of glycolysis in the 2-pyruvic acid entering into either of these cycles. It's either going to go into one or the other, not both at once. Right now we're going to focus on the alcoholic fermentation process. This is what causes like bread dough to rise. It's also how alcoholic beverages are produced. Here you're taking pyruvic acid, so your pyruvate from here, and your NADH, and you're creating NAD plus, and you're creating 2 carbon dioxides and alcohol. Now, lactic acid fermentation is what our bodies do. Your body has to supply its working muscles with oxygen. When oxygen is present, the glucose can be broken down into carbon dioxide, water, and ATP, but after about 90 seconds of exercise, the oxygen starts becoming scarce. Respiration continues at a slower pace because the body still has to make ATP. So lactic acid fermentation is what makes that ATP from the glucose when there is no oxygen. But it also produces lactic acid as a byproduct, and that's kind of what builds up, and that's what burns when your muscles are burning when you're doing some sort of exercise, and what kind of causes them to be sore afterwards. So after about 15 or 20 minutes of that type of exercise, your body has burned up most of the carbohydrates that it has, and it moves on to start burning fats. So this one does not give off carbon dioxide, but it does regenerate NAD+, so that glycolysis can continue. So if you think about both processes, the alcoholic and the lactic acid, they have the same 2 reactants. So they are both using pyruvic acid and NADH. They both have the NAD+ product in common. And this is needed to accept electrons when that glucose is broken down into pyruvic acid, and that's why the cycle continues. So, let's see. Humans are lactic acid fermenters. So, during brief periods without oxygen, many of the cells in our bodies are capable of producing ATP by using that lactic acid fermentation. The cells best adapted to doing that are muscle cells, which need really large supplies of ATP for a rapid burst of activity. The effects of this, though, are like muscle cramping, soreness, and fatigue. Until recently, a lot of people thought that that buildup of lactic acid was what was responsible for your muscle fatigue and soreness, but recently, researchers found that lactic acid can actually be used as a fuel by mitochondria to make more energy. So, let's say you are running a race. At the beginning of the race, the principal source of energy for your muscles is ATP that's already in the cell. And then once you run out of that, when you're running out of oxygen, then ATP is produced by lactic acid fermentation. Now, that's for quick energy. Long-term energy, respiration is going to release more energy a little bit more slowly than fermentation does. So the body stores energy in muscles and other tissues in the form of glycogen, which is a carbohydrate. These usually last about 15 or 20 minutes. After that, your body starts to break down other molecules like fats. So aerobic forms of exercise that require a lot of oxygen, so like running, dancing, swimming, these are beneficial for weight control, because if you do it for a long enough period of time, then you start burning your fat storage. But if you think about like this bear in the picture, he's probably going into hibernation during the wintertime. When he comes out, he's probably going to be a lot thinner because he will have used a lot of stored fat for his energy during hibernation, because he was hibernating, he couldn't get up and eat. All right. So, quick review. We talked about respiration. Respiration is taking sugar molecules, glucose from food, and it's taking oxygen, and it's going to produce water, carbon dioxide, and a lot of energy. When your body does not have oxygen to do respiration, then it's going to do fermentation. Our bodies do lactic acid fermentation. Other things like some microorganisms do alcoholic fermentation. And that is all. And I'm going to try to escape out of here. Okay.